it is it's going to be a
So
conversation.
I will put my time here.
Yeah. So it's a yeah. We do one a month. So because we couldn't do this one last month, so we're
Yeah.
going to do two now this month. So it's good. Yeah.
How is Johannesburg, Bongan?
Johannesburg is it's good. I mean, well, we were here not too long ago, so it's warmer now. A lot
Okay.
warmer. So it's nice. Lots of people outside walking around, and
Yeah.
it is. It's quite good. Yeah. So we are very well. Yeah. Just excited about this lecture. Just see.
Finally, it has come through.
Yeah, finally it has come through. Let's see quickly something. So we still have for 2 minutes or so. So we should give it maybe 5 minutes before we start.
Yeah, maybe let's give it.
Let's give it about 5 minutes before we start because people are joining in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Our next event is next is on the 22nd.
Yeah.
By Professor Sharon Hassan. The 22nd, yeah. So yeah, let us start in about 5 minutes.
Sorry, may I ask a question to Walter Mignolo?
I'm sorry?
May I ask a question to Walter Mignolo?
Isabello permits, yes.
Yes, please.
Hello, Walter Mignolo. I am Michaela Ott from Germany, and I wrote you an email some time ago concerning a publication on Deleuze and Guattari, which I called 1000-1 Plateaus. I do not know if you remember. You told me that I can use a text of yours, which is already published and so forth. But I just wanted to tell you that for the moment being, we do not have a publisher. We cannot tell everybody that it's going to happen. So I will communicate with you in I don't know, in some weeks probably, but for the moment being, I want to apologize for not responding and not informing you. But that's all. It's just a small aside. Thank you.
Well, I don't know what, I mean, you have a question, but I don't know what I can answer. But you mentioned an article where I talk about Deleuze and Guattari.
Yes, I wrote you that we want to publish a book called Mille Plateaux minus one plateau. And I asked you if you would be ready to contribute. And you said yes. And then I proposed that we take a little part of an already published text of yours. And you said yes, if Princeton is okay with it and so forth. But I do not want to disturb you now. I just want to tell you that I come back to you in some weeks. That's all.
So
just a good intervention. Okay.
So you sent me an email and we communicated on email before?
Yes.
Okay. I will look for an email and I will respond.
Yeah, it's no problem.
Okay.
It's just a little remark. Okay, thanks.
So we reconnect.
Give it 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Then we will start.
Yes.
Where are you in this moment, Mr. Mignolo? Are you in the north or in the south of Las Americas? Are you in the north or in the south of Las Americas? Yeah. Are you in the United States or are you in Argentina or somewhere else?
No, I am in the United States. I am going to Argentina at the end of the month.
Okay. Just to locate you a little bit. Thank you.
Right.
Bongani, what do you think? Do we start?
I think let us start. Let us start. People will join us.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Walter, for coming. Let me do some introductory remarks before we give you the floor. It is indeed our great pleasure to welcome you all to this 5th seminar. This is the 5th seminar in a series of monthly seminars on the theme of the changing African idea of Africa and the future of African studies. And this is a collaborative work between my chair here at the University of Bayreuth and the Institute of, and Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Study in South Africa. These events are conceived as seminars, signature events that advance thinking on Africa and African studies. And they are part of, here in Bayreuth, they are part of Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence, whose mandate is to advance the reconfiguration of African studies. And they are also part of what we call a knowledge lab here in Bayreuth, which actually features keynote events organized around questions of methodological innovation, theoretical innovations, and reflexive African studies. Today, we are privileged and honored to host Professor Walter D. Mignolo, who is William Hannay Winamaker Distinguished Professor of Romance Studies at Duke University, and a well-known semiotician and a leading scholar in decolonial investigations. And I don't need to over-introduce him because he is well-known. So, but what I can say is that Walter has gifted us with very useful concepts in the field of decolonial thinking, concepts such as bordernosis, epistemic disobedience, locus of enunciation, and many others. And today, Professor Mignolo will address us for a maximum of 60 minutes on the topic, Second Thoughts on Africa in the Colonial Horizon of Modernity. And I must say that after Walter's presentation, Dr. Bongani Ngqulunga will chair the Q&A session. For my part, I will now call upon Professor Walter to deliver the seminar. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Sabelo. Thank you, all of you who are organizing this fantastic series of lectures. And apologize also for all of you in the audience that attended the previous announced lecture that I missed by this kind of confusion of time lag between Europe and United States. So I am really glad that Sabelo and Bongani and kind of give me a second chance. So we will talk about the second thought on the colonial horizon of modernity, but I want to start with some kind of precautions. I am, as you know, I am neither an African citizen nor an African diasporic citizen. I am neither a specialist in Africa. So what kind of legitimize my talking about Africa, I say Africa in the colonial horizon of modernity, behind the friendship with Sabelo and the fact that we share beyond the friendship the concept of coloniality. So that's a kind of connection. So I will share a PowerPoint to make some kind of concepts and also images. I mean, when you talk about Africa and the colonial horizon of modernity, some images will help. So let me start sharing this. Are you seeing it? Yeah?
Not yet, not yet.
You don't see it?
No, no.
Huh. I see it on my screen. Let me... let me see.
Yeah, it's coming now.
It's coming, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I missed one click. I'm trying to kind of widen the screen.
Yep.
Oh, here. No, that is not what I want. That is it? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We are in business. Well, this is just the title. So what gave me some kind of legitimacy to talk about Africa, I will start with this kind of observation before going directly on the talk, but also are related. I mention Africa in many of my writing, but just in a paragraph and kind of connected with the colonial metric of power. We will talk a little bit about that. But there are two substantial articles that I published not too long ago, one in 2017 with the advent of black thinkers and the limit of continental philosophy, and the other Africa in the colonial horizon of Western modernity, published this year. So the second thought is, on the one hand, on the larger picture of the Africa and the colonial horizon of modernity, and also drawing in some specific of these two articles. So what I will talk about is about the colonial metric of power. So I don't know if you're familiar or not, but just for those of you who are not familiar, let me just give you some metaphorical definition or profile of the colonial metric of power. So you see, the unconscious for psychoanalysis, the unconscious doesn't exist. It's an invention of psychoanalysis. So people have dreamed all the time, right? Since we know it that our ancestor, the Neanderthalenses or the human, the Homo sapiens were walking on Earth. Everybody had dreams, but the unconscious was kind of an invention of psychoanalysis, very, very important, very useful. History, it doesn't exist. It's an invention of historian, and there is so the concept of history doesn't exist, I would say, beyond Western vocabulary and conceptual structure. Of course, people all over the places, from Asia, China, Africa, Aymaras, Quechuas, have memories of the past. And we have in the Americas written a record of the Aztec, for example, how they kind of build their past, not in alphabetic writing, but in what we call picture writing or hieroglyphic, etc. So everybody has memories, and everybody has some kind of record of the past, oral or visual. But that doesn't mean that history exists. History is an invention. Herodotus was talking about history, but he was talking about description. It's since the Roman that the concept of history as we know it today began to was introduced, and then it became with the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment became more of a kind of what we know today as a discipline. Society doesn't exist. Society is an invention of Western sociology. I mean, there were social thought in the 19th century, but sociology is an invention of the 19th century. So the colonial matrix of power doesn't exist in the same way. But the colonial matrix of power exists because of the colonial thinking, in the same way that the unconscious exists because of psychoanalytic thinking, and society exists because of sociological thinking, and history exists because of historiographical thinking. And you can go all the way. And you begin to realize that we live in a kind of fantasy of Western vocabulary, especially in the discipline. So, with that caveat in mind, I will come back to the colonial matrix of power at the end. But I will just give you a picture. We don't have a picture of the of society. We don't have a picture of the unconscious, but we have a picture of the colonial matrix of power. That facilitates the understanding. Okay, so I will come back at the end a little bit more about that. So we will have some grounding to understand what is designed here. So I have two parts. One is a map story, and the other is a series of basic concepts based on the colonial matrix of power and the map story. So imagine the world order before 1500. So before 1500, there are two chapters, let's call, of the Renaissance. 1350, according to the specialist in Renaissance studies, 1350 to 1500. So the Renaissance, at that time, was very important because people in Europe were doing what most of the people all around the world are doing today. They were re-emerging, they were reborn, because Europe at that time was a nothing place. I mean, the civilization, we call it today, was in Asia, was in China, was in Persia, the Kingdom of Africa, the Mali Kingdom, that now Mali is in a kind of turmoil. So the Renaissance became global and universal after 1500. Before 1500 was just what Europeans were trying to do, to kind of build themselves and rebuild themselves And they invented their ancestry. Their ancestors were the Greeks, and their ancestors were the Roman, and the Middle Ages too. But I mean, they kind of more cautious about that. But still, they took the importance that Christianity had and the university had in the Middle Ages that was created. Bologna, the University of Bologna. University of Coimbra in Portugal, the University of Salamanca, they were all kind of between the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So what is important here was the cosmogonies and the cosmologies of different places. It was the cosmogony and the cosmology that kind of oriented the way they organized themselves. They did what they did. They thought what they thought. There was no one cosmogony that was prevalent over the other before 1500. So there is a lot to say about the different kind of cosmogonies and cosmology. I mean, cosmogonies is kind of the narrative of the creation of the universe and the creation of the human being that are telling the story. So everybody has that. So the problem is that after 1500, one cosmogony, one cosmology began to become hegemonic later on, but dominant, and gain privilege over the other cosmology. So that is the second stage of the Renaissance, from 1500 to 1650, according to the standard. So what happened in 1500? Well, is the European, the Western European landed in what is called today America. And that was the kind of the initial moment of Western cosmogony that at that point was controlled by Christian theology, and St. Thomas Aquinas was the master in that, began to do two things at the same time. To constitute Europe as we know it today, in relation to the other places, and at the same time that they were kind of reconstituting themselves, they were destituting other cosmologies. So other cosmologies were differently kind of barbarian. They were kind of work of the devil. They were kind of primitive later on. But so the destitution secured the place of privilege of those who began to control economically, politically, in the form of governance, began to control knowledge through the creation of universities in the New World first, but then in Africa and then in Asia. So that is the kind of the crucial moment of the emergence of the colonial, modern colonial horizon, or the colonial horizon of modernity. The situation has changed before 1500, after 1500, was a radical change. I give you just a simple way. I understand that. Before 1500, the global order was polycentric. There were many centers. None of those centers were ideals. They were no kind of paradise. They were kind of exploitation inside, right? But there was no one single cosmology that began to kind of impose itself over the other. Yes, there were invasion here and there, and but they were kind of local. There was never one civilization, one cosmogony, one cosmology that began little by little to destitute all the cosmologies of the world. So then you began to see the Africa in the colonial horizon of modernity. So let me now give you more details about what I am saying. Before 1500, these are three examples, but you can have many more. There are three examples that exist in the archives. You can have many more that exist in another form, not in the kind of maybe oral memory. There would be other ways that people organize their territory. So you have here, before 1500, the famous Chinese nested rectangle. Okay? Of course, there was hierarchy, and so at the center were the kind of the dynasties, and the farther you got from the center, the people were kind of lesser like the people at the center. But also notice that that there are four orientations. There is no one line. There is one. There are four orientations. No, that this was the east because is where the sun rises. This was the west. This was the north, and this was the south. So the Aztecs, they have very convoluted, and then you have memory here because this is not the visual, it's also memory. And in the memory you have here, you have the counting of the year, and you have here the sign of the different, what we call month, that for them there were not 30 days, but they have two calendars, one what we call sacred and the other solar. The solar is very close to our. And they have also a center. A center for the Aztec was Tenochtitlan, there was Beijing. And then you have here four directions. You have the east, you have the west, you have the north, and you have the south. And those were very meaningful cosmologically because they have a kind of a spiritual forces. Each destination, let's say, have a color, and the color meant something in the combination of. And the Christians, by the 7th, 8th century, they have their own map, but there was not in 4, it was in 3. Why was it 3? Well, you see it here, because of the 3 sons of Noah. So this is the first moment of Africa in the colonial horizon of what will become modernity. So Asian and African have no idea of where, that they were kind of living in a place like this. This was only valid for the Christian, not for the African. The African could, I imagine, could care less about what the Christian were thinking about that time. The important thing here is that none of these cosmogonies, Chinese or Aztec, became hegemonic. Is this who, after 1500, became hegemonic, with all the consequences, politically, economically, religious, epistemically, etc. So before that, and this is all this is very well studied by Mudimbe, Valentine Mudimbe, in the idea of Africa. But first the invention of Africa, and then the idea of Africa. What Mudimbe did, that he have this kind of knowledge that I don't, was to trace the invention of Africa since the Greek. So here we have a Greek map, right? A Greek map where, but you see the 3 continents. There's not Africa yet. There was Libya. Africa appears, this is Greek. Africa appears in the horizon of Western Christians. That there are, you know, the reason why was called Libya, etc. We will go into that, but this again was meaningful for the Greeks, was not meaningful for Africa, and was not meaningful from Asia, and America is out of the picture. And Incas and Aztecs could care less. They were not protesting because they were not considered into the world map. The world map, that was the way that Greek and then Christian perceive the masses of land and water. Now, by the 12th century, this very interesting map by Al-Idrisi, and I have nothing to do with the Christian, of course. That is another. It has to do with the Greek map that I think is Strabo. I don't remember this is Strabo or Ptolemy, one of the two. So for Al-Idrisi, this may have been something he knew, but look at this map. What is Libya or Africa here? Difficult to say. But I will say, here is Africa. Africa is in the north. This is the Mediterranean. This is the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. Because Al-Idrisi put the south, I mean, Africa is in the south, is the north according to our. Africa is in the south because for Al-Idrisi the south was on top. Not the east, not the north, but the south. So you see, Al-Idrisi is clear if you kind of turn the map, Al-Idrisi map around, and you say, well, now it is clear. Here is the Mediterranean, here is Africa, here is the Iberian Peninsula, here is Europe, here is England, right? So, but for Al-Idrisi, Africa didn't have any kind of yet connotation, and that as we'll have later on. Well, now something very important happened after 1500. And that is related to what I was saying before about constitution destitution. This is Abraham Ortelius' world map, or Typus Orbis Terrarum, Orbis. This map was published by the great Dutch map makers in 1570. And look what happened. Well, the navigation already gave empirical knowledge to the map makers to have a better idea of the land masses and the water masses. There are, of course, some distortion in distance and all that, but this is pretty much of what we see today in a planisphere, in a kind of horizontal map, not in the globe. Okay, so there is Africa in the south of Europe, and there is Asia, and there is North America, and this is South America. So what happened with the maps I showed you before? They were destituted. This is the reality of the world. And we believe it, and a lot of people believe it. But it is not. It's the way that European managed to kind of make an image of the world and place the north here and the east and the west and the south, and to put the Atlantic in the center. Why the Atlantic will be in the center of a round planet, right? So this map was taken by the Jesuit Matthew Ricci, more specifically in 1582, 83, 84. He went. The Jesuit began to travel the planet. So they went to Asia because Africa was the son of Africa belonged to Ham, the bad guy of Noah, as I saw you in there. So there was nothing for the European in Africa, but Asia, well, it was Japan, and it was the spices that Columbus was trying to, and Marco Polo and Mandeville. I mean, there was a lot of travelers that kind of brought information. So Matthew Ricci the Jesuit went to Asia with this map. And there is a story that they show this map to the wise men of the Qing dynasty. That was the Qing dynasty was the kind of the dominant dynasty at the time. And the story by the same Matthew Ricci said that they came and they admired the map. You know, Chinese are very polite. But then I asked, they said, why is China is in the center? Remember the map of the rectangle. If China is in the center, why you put it in the upper right corner? that is something wrong there. They said it very diplomatically, but apparently Matthew Ricci listened to the story, and they presented something like this, which is today the map that you see in Asia. You see it in China, you see it in Hong Kong, you see it in Singapore, etc. So what happened here? What happened here is that the Pacific is at the center. That changes a lot of things. And that began to help us understanding what is going on now in the South China Sea and the kind of re-emergence of the Pacific, of the Indian Ocean, etc. So Africa again is outside of this kind of consideration, because at that time what Africa is providing is massive amount of human being captive and enslaved. So that is the presence of Africa in the 16th, 17th century. Whatever happened in Africa for Europeans and for Europeans in Europe, for Europeans in what became America, what really counted, Africa counted as a kind of as human resources in the sense of labor and enslaved labor. Okay, so this is just to show you a better image of the Matthew Ricci map that then became designed by the own Chinese. So this is a design of a Chinese map. There is a story about this map, but we won't go into that. Let me just get the map in itself and close this part of the story of map. What happened here is, on the one hand, the destitution of all other territorialities, and the destitution of all other cosmogonies and cosmology, and the destitution of all other kind of practice of living, economy, organization of governance, including subjectivity, because people began to be seen as inferior to the human. The human was, there are no human being. Human being is, again, it's a Western vocabulary. And human being or human species, but human is with big H. And the human with big H was a standard to racialize people and to sexualize people and to racialize, sexualize. So human was a category that helps to diminish or to make other people lesser human. Race, the concept of race doesn't exist until the 16th century. Quijano, I wrote about that, etc., and way into detail. So people now look for racial kind of classification or categories in the past, but this is a kind of anachronistic. It's a kind of understanding of the past from the category of race that emerged in the 16th century. And emerged in the 16th century first in the Iberian Peninsula to classify, to denigrate to lesser Muslim and Jews. Because at that time, for the organization of what we call today society, the term was caste. Race was a concept applied to the horses of pure blood that still exist today, that is are being used for kind of horse races and all this kind of thing. And in the dictionary definition, once they gave the definition of race applied to the horses, they add, and it is also said of Moor and Jews. Now, you have a kind of control of subjectivity there. For the Christian, Jews and Muslims began to be seen in relation to horses. And for Jews and Muslims in Spain, the subjectivity is transformed because they are being seen as lesser. And that is the important concept, Fanon concept of sociogenesis. I say my identity is not something that I am essentially. My identity is an identification. Either that I can identify, I have the power of identifying, and that was the Christian, or that I am identified. So the problem now for a lot of people is disidentification, and disidentification is one part of what we call, in general, decolonization or decoloniality. So the point is here that the constitution of this kind of reality, geographic, political, economic, because everything began to be seen. So economy began to be seen here. Transportation of alcohol and guns to Africa, human beings to the Americas, and sugar, cotton, coffee, etc., to Europe. That displaces the importance of the Mediterranean in all aspects, and began to destitute the other cultures and cosmologies. Okay, so well, I won't go into that. I will just say that once the Ortelius or the people have this image of the map of the planet, this, of course, this map was not yet seen like this at the beginning of 1600, but after Ortelius that became very clear. So what I want to tell you here is that in 1492, when still today the rest of the planet was not clear, but was very clear this, the triangular relation between Europe, which is Spain, and Africa and the Americas, that was clear, and that was the Atlantic. And that's when Alexander VI appropriated this part of the world and gave half of to the Portuguese and half to Spain. So you began to see there how the kind of the universal theological and philosophical thinking of the time, of the Renaissance, comes together with globalization of it. So globalization is the process of expanding all over the globe this kind of universal truth of in every aspect of life that the European controlled. So the Pope, who was at that point the maximum authority of the Western Christians and Western Europe, gave by the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1492, half of the land and water rights to the Portuguese and half to the Spanish. In 1529, Alexander was no longer there, but the King of Spain and the King of Portugal liked the idea, and they made another treaties, what they called the Treaty of Zaragoza of 1529. And they did the same, half for the Spanish and half for the Portuguese. Now, people say today the division between East and West is constructed, of course. But who constructed? When was constructed? Why was constructed? So there is a kind of decolonial question in trying to understand the colonial horizon of modernity, and in this case, the place of Africa, but also the place of all the other continents and Africa in relation to other continents in the colonial horizon of modernity. Okay. This was the first part. So the second part is conceptual, but it's based on everything I said, and I hope that the maps help to do that. The second part, I have 15 minutes, and I think I can do it. The making and unmaking of the colonial and imperial difference. So these are two key concepts for the way we, and when I say we, all of us who follow Quijano, the psychoanalysts follow Freud, and the Marxists follow Marx, and the European sociologists follow Weber. So we follow Quijano. Quijano for us was a groundbreaking moment. I mean, no, not the only one, but that is the. Again, I mean, Marxism or psychoanalysis are not universal. Or kind of, there is another way of thinking economy, another way of thinking the kind of the psychological behavior of the people. But there are certain conceptualization that become an anchor to understand certain phenomena. So what are the colonial and the imperial differences? The colonial imperial difference, for everything I said before, do not exist in reality, right? You cannot do a kind of an empirical research you cannot do an empirical research of history as an abstract. You can tell histories, but you cannot study history as an entity. So who made the colonial and imperial differences? And why? Why, and what is the difference? They're talking about difference, the distinction, would say. What is the distinction between the colonial imperial difference and cultural differences that we talked about today? Either we talk about cultural difference domestically without a given country, or we talk also cultural difference between countries and between regions. We talk about, I mean, Asian culture, African culture, etc., etc. So the question is in those differences, there is not just, they are not cultural, they are colonial or imperial, depending the case. Why? Because there is power differential. And the power differential is when we say South American culture, or not American culture, North American culture, but South American culture, African culture, Asian culture, that are generalization, they are always conceived and defined from European culture. So we go again into cosmogonies, and then theology, and then science and philosophy, and then the human science, etc. And it's this control of knowledge since the Renaissance, control of knowledge together with material expansion, that began to create the colonial differences. So what I told you about the Jews and the Moors, they are like kind of put together with horses. That is the making of colonial differences. I would say with the Jews was a colonial difference, but with the Muslim was imperial differences. Why was imperial differences? Because the caliphate, the Muslims have a caliphate in Granada, and they extended to France. So at that point, the difference between the kingdom of Castile, that was in the process of building itself, established the imperial difference with the Muslim that they expelled, but also they established the kind of difference between religions. But religious was not just kind of belief, was a whole system of knowledge. What was destituted there is a tremendous amount of knowledge that the Muslim had of the Greek since the 6th, 7th, 11th century. What is destituted there is how much the Renaissance owed in architecture, in arithmetic, in geometry, to Muslim caliphate. So that's a kind of the colonial difference, imperial difference is kind of destitute a structure of power that is like you or superior, let's say, but that you are kind of gaining territories into destituting the civilization. But with the, in the case of the Jews, I would say the colonial difference, because the Jews at that point didn't have a state. They were kind of a stateless people in, well, in Europe, but the issue is more complex. But in general, we recognize canonically that the Jews didn't have a state until 1948. So in that sense, the Jews and the African and the indigenous people were kind of endowed through the colonial difference, because the Spanish didn't recognize the Incas and the Aztec at the same level than the Caliphate. So they just transformed everybody in Indians. So Indians and Africans were lesser human beings. So the Spaniards didn't consider the Kingdom of Africa, that were very strong at that time. They considered the captive African that were transported as enslaved. So the colonial difference was projected to them as people without religions. The Jews and the Muslims have their own religion, and Africans, enslaved African, indigenous didn't have religion. They were kind of managed by the devil. So you see there how the constitution of a concept of human began to gain traction. And that concept of the human became hegemonic. as the model to judge other culture, civilization, etc. No? So the colonial and imperial difference are two basic strategies in the construction of the colonial matrix of power. When we talk about coloniality of knowledge, for example, it means, what does it mean, coloniality of knowledge? Coloniality of knowledge means that there is one knowledge that is valid, which is kind of the Western Renaissance after the Enlightenment, and the other knowledges were destitute. And where the other knowledge were destitute, the languages, because knowledge is come in many forms, but in the way that is kind of dominant is through languages, through concepts, through verbs, through words, etc. So you began to see that the making and the colonial imperial difference have 6 European languages working and creating this difference, which is Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, dominant during the Renaissance, English, French, and German after the Enlightenment. So the imperial and colonial difference are managed, built, constructed, controlled through language. So again, there are not colonial imperial difference in reality. You cannot make an empirical investigation of that, but you can do an empirical investigation of the discourses and images in which, since the Renaissance, other people, other region, other civilization become destituted through the colonial or imperial differences. So what I don't have time to go into the making of colonial imperial difference over 500 years, but I just give you some example of the 16th century. But you can see, those of you who are familiar with Enlightenment, how this imperial colonial difference began to be re-articulated. For example, the concept of race is no longer related to religion and blood. It became more kind of scientific, and then become related to skin, which is today, right? The destitution of the Muslims and the Jews continues, but acquire a different dimension. In the late 18th century and the 19th century, Jews and Muslims became Arabs and secular Jews. So they were secularized in the view of the West. And that is the confusion today between Arabs and Islam. It's because in the 18th century, the Muslims were all kind of Arab, secular Arabs. And you can see that in Kant. Now, what's interesting is when the Jews become secular Jews and the view of the European, and the nation state is created in the 19th century, we have the origin of Zionism. Zionism emerged in the second half of the 19th century under this kind of two conditions: the nation state, the secular nation state in Europe, and the idea of secular Jews. So Zionism at the beginning was secular, and then it's a long history of the kind of the complication. None of the religious Jews at the time supported the idea of Zionism, because it was kind of contrary. Secularism was contrary to kind of religious thinking. Now, what I am more interested now to talk about, and I would say that I am talking here in the second thought of Africa and the colonial horizon of modernity, because I talk about Africa more specifically in those two articles. But what I am giving you is the kind of the kitchen, the background of the kind of a scheme in which I am thinking what I am thinking, and I wrote what I wrote in those two articles. But what is crucial today is what is happening, the unmaking of the imperial and colonial difference. And that is going on all over the globe, and is going on also in Europe, Western Europe and United States. Is Europe and United States because of different kind of migration. So what we are seeing now in both places, this kind of renaissance of the destituted, the reconstitution of the destituted, and what has been destituted, is all over the planet, but is also in Europe and United States. So let's view very kind of quickly the, because I'm running out of time, and then we have time to talk more, are the responses to the damage produced, inflicted by the colonial and imperial differences. So the colonial imperial difference secure the superiority of the West by kind of diminishing the relevance of other region, other culture, other knowledge, other people, etc., etc., etc. So the responses today, since 1495 until today, are responses to the colonial and the imperial difference. So the response of the colonial difference, people in Africa, people in Asia too, but you people in Africa know it very well, is the long process of decolonization during the Cold War. And this process of decolonization was aiming at constituting the nation state, which, as we know, and we know it in South America since the 19th century, the nation state was not an institution for liberation, but it was an institution of was an institution to institute internal colonialism, meaning that an elite in each of the African country or an elite in each of the South American country did the same that the settler, the imperial settler was doing, but in their own name. And they continue to kind of subalternize, let's put it that way, the population in each state. So in that sense, when we look at the state, decolonization was a victory and was a failure. Was a victory because they managed to kick the settler out, and was a failure because they didn't change political economy, they didn't change education, they didn't change political theory. So the colonial state, or the state in the colonial horizon of modernity, remain dependent to the European and now United States. So the concept of dependency is another way we can understand the colonial and imperial difference. The colonial and imperial difference is the kind of the condition of the dependency until you say, well, enough is enough. So if decolonization was a failure in terms of the nation state remaining caught into the web of the colonial matrix of power, decolonization left a tremendous amount of thinking, of thought. And this thought is what began to turn around and turn away from the dominance of the canon of Western thought and the Western thinking. So in general, when I talk about decolonization in a certain way, I talk about decolonization of, following Quijano. But in general, decolonization are different ways of responding the linking to the dependency and denying the colonial differences, rejecting the colonial difference, negating the colonial difference. Say, what it doesn't mean that I am lesser human. Come on. How can be human somebody who, in the name of humanity, exploit and enslave other people? So that's a kind of the process, the argument. And the imperial difference, we see it today. We saw it in the 16th century with the Caliphate, but also later on in the 16th century with the Ottoman Sultanate. The Spaniard couldn't say that the Sultanate was inferior to them, because Suleiman the Magnificent has a tremendous kind of power and structure. But they managed to install the imperial difference to make them people with the wrong religion. So the imperial difference crosses the 500 years, and now the imperial difference is projected in Russia and China. That is a continuation of the imperial difference. But you see that the imperial difference is also mixed up with the colonial difference racially. And we can say that, or can venture to say, guess, that a lot of what's going on today in United States and European Union demonization of Russia and China and Iran has a lot of racist feeling, emotion, and thinking into it. So the imperial difference began to kind of be the response of the colonial difference, the process of de-Westernization. De-Westernization with China kind of getting stronger, Russia reconstituting itself, and Islam kind of becoming more and more assertive in responses to the denigration of the West. So I call that de-Westernization. And de-Westernization is capitalist. They don't reject the colonial metro power. What they reject are the instruction of the West of what they have to do. So in that sense, they are different from de-Westernization. Why? Because de-Westernization different from decolonization, because de-Westernization is a state-led project, where decolonization is a people-led project, not mixed up with the state. And I think this is crucial at this point. Now, the response to that was a counter-reformation, what I call re-Westernization. And re-Westernization, and we see it today both at the level of the public sphere. For example, in the United States, Black Lives Matter. This is a public sphere. It's a people movement. But we can see it today. The re-Westernization trying to preserve privilege, to preserve the privilege of white supremacy in front of what's happening. I mean, the statues come down, and in South Africa, in the United States, etc. And it's not just the statues that come down, it's that the changing in subjectivity and subject of discourse of that. So, to the growth of China and to the growth of decolonization in general, what we call decoloniality, because this movement are no longer trying to capture the state, trying to transform, to do something else at the level of the public sphere, is a counter-reformation. It's a counter-reformation of the North Atlantic to contain both at the level of the state, China and Russia and Iran, and on the other one, the other level, to contain all this kind of resurgence of racialized people, of sexualized people, not just men and women, but also LGTB, etc., etc. So I think that this is a terrific. We are living a terrific moment. tragic moment, but at the same time full of hope. And I think a lot of things are going on in Africa at both levels. The fact that a significant amount of African states didn't support United States restriction against Russia is quite significant. That the Mali people are kind of establishing connection with Russia is quite significant. But also there is a tremendous renaissance in thinking. And I mean, Sabelo is one of these, and Achille Membe, and Felwine Sarr. And in the art, there is a tremendous resurgence and affirmation of the people in front of the knowledge of the kind of the dominance of aesthetic and art conceptualization of Europe. Well, I stopped there. I'm sorry that went a little bit too long. I can come back to the colonial matrix of power if there is time, but I don't want to keep on talking. I want to just establish a conversation.
Thank you very much, Walter, for a very wonderful, engaging lecture. Colleagues, usually we have about 50 minutes or so for discussion, for questions, comments. I mean, there are two ways in which you can pose your questions. You can either write them on our chat or raise your hand to give you a moment to speak. I mean, I see there is already a question by Vishwas. I don't know whether, Walter, we can start there. Only right, say, I don't know, Vishwas, whether you want to speak or should we read?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, great. Vishwas says, colonized imperial powers use the concept of the human to accentuate racist differences. But what was the conception of the human amongst the oppressed peoples? How did Africans, for instance, understand the human? And can this reclamation of the subaltern human contribute to the colonial project? So that
thank you. Very important question.
Yeah, if you can address it while we invite other colleagues, but if you can go ahead, Walter.
Okay. So what I do, I cannot respond?
Yes, please respond. Please respond.
Okay. So the first question about the two articles, the reference are in the first slide I show. I gave the two references. So I can, if I can manage, I can go back and put it in the chat. Well, this is that question is crucial because it's one of the main tasks of the colonial doing and thinking. What do I mean? It's not just thinking ourselves and talking about ourselves that that the imperial concept of human was an excuse to subalternize people. That's kind of, we can call thinking. Doing, we have to do something. And how do we, what can we do here? We cannot solve this problem by putting bomb. The concept of a human is a conceptual. The concept of a human is conceptual. It's linguistics. Is that run through narratives and argument and description. So that is what we have to address. To come up with counter argument. But the counter argument is not just anti and say, oh, listen, the Western concept of the human is imperial and is kind of an excuse for exploitation. No, we have to come up with a different kind of conceptualization. So Sylvia Wynter have a fantastic article. She is a Caribbean, you know, African diaspora, that you can find in the web. is a magisterial article addressing this question. She addressed this question as Black Caribbean Third World women. So all of that are kind of the colonial difference, the making of the colonial difference to which she responds. It's a magnificent piece. But I would say another thing. Let's take Ubuntu. I don't know much about, but you can elaborate yourself about that. Ubuntu, as I understand, I am because you are. Well, that is already throwing the concept, the Western concept of the human, out of the garbage. Why? Because the Western concept of human is individual. It's the invention of the individual in the Renaissance, consolidated in the Enlightenment, and exploding in the 20th century United States, and Trump is a magnificent example of that. What is Ubuntu? Means, as I understand, I am because you are, but also because we are not just isolated people in this world. We kind of coexist with everything that exists on the planet Earth. So in Quechua, they have a concept, runa, that is translated as human, but this is a tremendous appropriation through the colonial difference. Why? Because, again, human is individual, is male. I forgot to say that. Even if they say human refer to male and female, that is definition. In the image of human is man, male. So runa cannot be translated as human. Why? Because runa is like Ubuntu. I am because of the communal. I am because all of us are. And I am because of the llamas, because of the river, because of the trees, because of the wind, because of the wild, all that. The human, on the one hand, destituted a lot of people, and on the other hand, cut the relationship with what we call today nature. And that is a crucial issue for our time, that we are talking about climate change. So that is, in Chinese we have Ren. And Ren is all, I mean, Ren is, yes, what we call the human species, the animals that we are, that walk into extremities and use the other thing to do computing. But Ren is one kind of living organism under heaven. And the cosmological concept of China is all under heaven. So this is the kind of the way that we have to do, just to counter, not just to critiquing, but to advance in arguments and in the images of other way of being in the world, because that is what really counts. It's not the definition, it's also the kind of the subjectivity, our feeling of being in the world. Otherwise, to kind of delink ourselves, not just from the human with a capital H, but also from the individuality, from the individual isolated, which is the basis of liberalism, for example, and is being extremed by neoliberalism. Okay, that for the first point. Africa, you want to read the second one?
The second one by Michaela. What do you mean by re-Westernization? I think that's what it says.
Oh, okay. What I mean by de or re-Westernization? African,
I think it is.
I wrote re-Westernization. Re-Westernization.
Re-Westernization. Thank
Yes.
you, because I didn't elaborate on that. Let me just give you the story and then the kind of the conceptual elaboration. The story is this. The invasion of Iraq, and the more people knew about the collapse of the Twin Towers, the more United States was using the cloud it had. It was not manifested in the newspaper, but people who have kind of situation where they can make decision began to realize the failure of the two events. I mean, the failure, the Twin Tower is more difficult because it's impossible to decide whether it was really Al-Qaeda or was planned to justify what it came later, which is a kind of the triumph of neoliberalism. The triumph of the global design of neoliberalism was not just to capitalists, because capitalism that doesn't have an owner, but the plan of the project, the design of neoliberal design, it was to homogenize the world. And that is going on today in the process of containing Asia, China, and containing Africa. So in 2008, when Obama became president, he realized it. I mean, he realized that things were not what it was, or what they were before. And there is another economic and political issues that were going on inside the United States. But to make a long story short, Obama realized that something had to be done because United States was losing clout. So he did, in the first period of presidency, he did two things. Immediately, the famous discourse of El Cairo, where he trying to kind of attract attention of the Muslim. And the second one was in 2011 was Hillary Clinton, and you can find that discourse in the web, a discourse that Clinton gave in Honolulu, and she was talking about that the Pacific, she was talking about the Pacific century. And the Pacific century, she define it as the Pacific century will be the United States Pacific century. So you began to see that they began to feel de-Westernization, right? So we have to pay attention to the Pacific because that is where things began to be hot. So re-Westernization is the counter-reformation. And I use this metaphorically because when Luther in the 16th century came up with the kind of the Protestant Reformation, what was the response of Catholic? The counter-reformation. So re-Westernization is the counter-reformation to contain de-Westernization. And again, this is becoming for me clear every day in the politics of the United States and the European Union to contain Russia and China mainly, but also Iran. And this is the vocabulary they use, to contain. When you use that vocabulary, you are playing defense. And this is the first time in 500 years that the West is playing defense. And that defense has been motivated at the level of the state, at the economy, technology, politics, at the level of the state. But also they have to contain the movement of the people. So Black Lives Matter is what, but this is kind of exploding all over the places. So there are less visible way of containment in the public sphere, but one manifest is in the university. Look what happened in France with 100 or so professors that kind of signed already two manifests against decolonization, because the people, the colored people, the people from the other part of the world invade the university and bring other kind of knowledge and subjectivity and emotion. So is more clear, Micaela, what re-Westernization means? And let me add that.
Yes, thank you very much.
And let me add this kind of cherry on the cake. I think that today, and it's important to think about that, there are three trajectories, diverse, but you can identify it. Three trajectories coexisting: de-Westernization, re-Westernization, and decoloniality. There are possibilities of alliance in some places, but in general, these three trajectories coexist in conflict, not in pacific coexistence. So it's very important for kind of decolonial thinking to keep in mind what is the sphere that decoloniality, in the specific way I am doing it, or in general, could be effective. Cannot be effective at this point at the level of the state and international relation. That structure is too big. We are no longer in the Cold War. It was possible to imagine and build a nation state. But today, think about that is impossible. And we see it all over the place. We see it in Cuba, for example, that was very successful at a certain point, but now having the state in the interstate system, now dominated by this kind of conflict between re-Westernization and de-Westernization, leave other places of operation for decolonization. Okay. So thank you, Micaela, for the question.
Thank you very much. Thank you. There are new questions now, many
Yes,
of them.
There are questions. Perhaps we should go to Emmanuel's question. And the question is, when the global north and its scholars are also in the center of the decolonial discourse, what does that mean for the global
Wait. Can you wait a second?
Okay.
I lost the image of, and I don't know how to come back. Oh, here. Oh.
Yes. We can see you, Walter.
Now I have to kind of see all of you. How do I do that? I would like to see all the screen, because that's the kind of, and I would like to see the chat.
Okay.
You can come back to Zoom on the taskbar.
Yeah. Now wait a second. There is something that I don't know what I touch, and that is the problem with. FaceTime, blur, choose virtual background. I have no idea what I did. I found the camera someplace and I click. Okay.
There's a question by Emmanuel. And the question is, when the global north and its scholars are also in the center of the decolonial discourse, what does that mean for the global south?
That is that's a very important to keep in mind that. So let me just make a few provision there. I am in the north, but all my discourse and my emotion is from South America. It's from South America and from Quijano that myself and other people in the north, some in Europe also, are talking about decolonization. So Sabelo now is in the north, but also he is working with South Africa. So I think that there are many people like us, like Sabelo and myself, who have one leg in South America, in my case, in Africa, El Sabelo, and other in the north. And we do different kind of things. When I talk and do things in South America, it's a different kind of discourse. I mean, I can talk about this, what I just talked about, but at the same time, there is a different context that I have to kind of adapt to make this kind of the argument that I made it to an audience that is interested in Africa. I imagine that for Sabelo is the same when he goes to Africa and work with African people. Well, that's one thing. So the migrant scholar, intellectual, activist. So there is a third category, that there are activists, scholar, intellectual in the south, that they can come to the north, but they are based in the south. So that is a different. It's very important. It's very important that they do what they do in the south, but at the same time they visit, they give lecture, they gave seminar, workshop, etc. in the north, bring the presence of the South. Why? Because what we are seeing is that until recently, the South was just the privilege of the North description. The destitution means not just that the destitute people, but the destitute knowledge. One example is the classical example of anthropology. Now anthropology changed a lot, but at one point, we'll say before the 80s, anthropologists investigated and described the people of the South, but they didn't take into account the thinking of them. So the thinking of them was a kind of an object that kind of helped them to understand the social organization, economy, etc. So what is important, is people in the South now, intellectual activists, artists, etc., journalists, in the South or in the North, are bringing that knowledge forward. We don't accept anymore being described by European discourse. And I think this is a tremendous change that operates intellectual in the South and intellectual in the North. Intellectual, South intellectual in the North. Now, they come the intellectual in the North. Yes, in the United States, it's interesting. In United States, decolonization, by what we can call white people in general, is non-existent. The people and it's a minority of people who talk about decolonization, are people like coming from the third world. But in Europe, I go a lot to Europe for the past 10, 15 years. I have been going to Europe all the time, and I get. So I think that the question goes there. I mean, what is the meaning of northern people to talk about decolonization. But that is a very complicated issue, but we have to pay attention and think about that. On the one hand, is the kind of the easy appropriation. Is the kind of the feeling that, well, we created the problem and now we have the solution for the rest of the world. So decolonization in Europe will bring the solution, and we apologize for the crime that our ancestor committed. I would say that this is kind of arrogant uses of decoloniality. But there are other sectors of European people that I am working with, that is a director of museum from Scotland, an architect from Italy, and a wife from Palestine. They start talking about demodernization. And demodernization, they begin to see this their task, but they learn that from decolonization. And that is very interesting, because what they can do as European in the name of demodernization, and they are doing it in architecture. I mean, they are kind of demodernizing fascist architecture in Italy. And Charles Esch, who is the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Van Abbey Museum in Holland, he's doing that in the museum. So you go to the museum now and you have a permanent exhibit, and all this kind of concepts and perspective is kind of bringing forward. So there is, for example, in a room where he put Césaire and Picasso together, and began to kind of re-elaborate the relation between, not just in the name of decolonization, but that we see demodernization as the task they should do in Europe, and decolonization will be more of the project of people in the South, and people from the South in the North. See, it's very complex, but I think we have to think about that, because it affects the everyday activities, everyday life. I am looking at the...
Yes, the next one is, the next question, in a sense, which is related to the question that we have just answered. It says, can you kindly explain the link or disconnect between decoloniality, as articulated by Global South scholars like you, Sabelo, Mbembe, etc., and the Global North scholars and their development agencies?
Wow. I would go back one step back. There is somebody wrote discourse equal project. I don't know what that means, but what kind of bring to my mind is that, yes, projects are manifested in discourse, oral or written, in the sense that we have to go here to respond to this question, to the concept of languaging, not just language, but languaging as a verb. And languages as a verb is that we, not just as individual, but as Ubuntu, we are because we are in the communal, like in the Aymaras. So languaging allow us to coordinate our doing. And in the coordination of our doing, that's everyday life. I mean, how are we going to organize, I don't know, a family party, or how are we going to organize to kind of a ritual, etc. But there are more demanding projects, like, for example, in the case of the Aymara, but in the case of the of Africa, the project, let's say, of decolonization. And the project of decolonization is manifested in discourse, not just in discourse that you are writing or you express in lecture like this, but there is a lot of conversation before that. And that's what languaging allows. For example, I mean, we have been languaging with Sebelo for a long time. Not every day, but it's a kind of changing conversation, a discourse idea. So that's well, what is the difference? The difference is that the NGO are modern or postmodern project and discourse. They want to develop. But development, we know that is an instrument of coloniality, economic coloniality. Let me say that in another way. Development is a crucial concept in the rhetoric of Western economy after 1945. Didn't exist development before that. What existed was progress. That was the British concept. Development was introduced by Harry Truman in 1949, and he created the concept of development and modernization to modernize and develop the underdeveloped, another concept. So the NGO, the way I see it, is that they are trying to do a kind of good, humane development. Well, you can look at the rhetoric of sustainable development. Well, yeah, sustainable development could solve some. It's like aspirin. No? You can kind of calm the pain, but the problem is not the sustainability. The problem is development. While you maintain development, you are into the rhetoric of modernity or post-modernity, whatever you want to call it. What we call decoloniality, and Sabelo, Membe, Felwin, and many other people, indigenous people also in the Americas, two things. Number one, we talk about colonization and modernization. When we talk about colonization and modernization, we talk about specific cases. I mean, colonization and modernization of Uganda or Bolivia or whatever. But when we talk about modernity and decoloniality, we are talking in the first case about the rhetoric of modernity that is common to all specific experiment of development. The development in Uganda or Nigeria will be different to one in Peru, but they have the same logic. So the logic of coloniality is hidden by the rhetoric of modernity. The rhetoric of modernity is always salvation. Development is for the good, but that hides coloniality. So when we talk about the decolonization in Nigeria or decolonization in Bolivia or decolonization here or there, we are talking about specific ways that decolonization is being enacted. When we talk about decoloniality, so the way Sabelo or Achille do it in Southern Africa, or we do it in South America, is different because the local histories are different, because the languages are different, because the conditions are different. But what we have in common is the logic of coloniality and the rhetoric of modernity. And what we are building is the grammar of decoloniality. And the grammar of decoloniality is the grammar that kind of the link from the rhetoric of modernity and the logic of coloniality. You see what I mean? I mean, we talk about modernity as the modernity coloniality as the rhetoric and the logic of domination. And we talk about decoloniality as the grammar of decolonization. And the example of the human could be one. In that sense, there is a decolonial work to be done in the sense of decoloniality, but in the sense of decolonization, how you will do this in Africa, how we do that in South America, how the indigenous people in Canada will do it, how people in China will do it, is different. But we are connected through all looking for a grammar, interconnected grammar of decoloniality. I don't know if that makes sense or I confuse you more.
Before that, there is another question, Walter. It's a question by Linda. How do we deal with the dissemination, destitution of the material in colonial contexts through the successfully established systems of resource extraction, human exploitation, and the structures of oppressive inequality? Decoloniality seems to be a doomed project, while humans have become trapped in new totalizing oppression at the level of the material survivor. And then I'll come to you, Mushonga, after Walter has answered this question.
Oh, the second part, could you please speak a little more about loudly? Okay. I am speaking quite loudly, but
yes, okay, let me try to speak loudly.
Well, I put myself closer to the...
Oh, yes, oh no, somebody was saying I must speak loudly. Yeah, but the last part of the question is that decoloniality seems to be a doomed project. Right. While humans have become trapped in new projects.
No, absolutely. I will say that there is no triumphal project in that domain. Marxism is a doomed project. Theology of liberation is the doomed project. And there is no kind of conceptual project that at this point can do something materially effective. The only thing that is being done materially and is effective is the manifestation. The people affected in the area of extractivism, for example, where they are kind of creating lake of water and cyanide, where the kind of the birth people, I mean the kids are born kind of with a lot of defects. What I have to add to that is that decoloniality is not, doesn't promise to be the savior of the world. Decolonization was not the savior of the world when they created nation states. Marxism was not the savior of the world. On the contrary, kind of the big experiment of the Soviet Union and Mao failed. There are a lot to discuss about that. But the question is that on the one hand, decoloniality is not the only project that confront injustice. There are many other projects that confront injustice. And the second, I don't see in the material dimension that you mentioned who is doing something that will satisfy your question. I think that the main task of decoloniality is more toward the future, and I mean not the future, imagining future, to the young generation, the generation that will take the lead. Because those barbarities that you list in your question are the barbarities of the human. And there is no force beyond the manifestation, the kind of the multitude, the people manifesting. People can stop projects. in Guatemala or can stop project in Dakota, etc. But that needs a kind of, that doesn't need decolonization, and that doesn't need Marxism, and that doesn't need theology of liberation. That needs the indignation of the people and the people getting together and building their own project. So decolonization is not the savior of the people who are not into the academy, etc., etc. So I think that this is a very important issue to think about because it's crucial today. As I said before, doesn't make any sense today to try to capture a nation state and end up with extractivism and end up with war. That, if you are realistic, that is a kind of impossible task. And I think we have to recognize the limit of what we are doing, but at the same time, the possibilities. I don't know if makes sense.
Thank you. Mushonga, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bongan, and thank you, Walter, for this kind of discourse. And I think I was excited to learn more in terms of the ideas that before 1500 the world was polycentric, and that there was no single cosmology until after 1500, which then led to the destitution of the rest of the other cosmologies, cultures, knowledges, economies, and the like. What I'm interested to find out from you, Walter, is that do you teach this discourse in your university, which is a global North university? And if you do teach this discourse and engage in this discourse with your fellow intellectuals and students, majority of whom I assume, belong on the other side of the colonial divide, I would like to know, what kind of response and what kind of critique do you get from fellow intellectuals and fellow students of this discourse? Because it's very enriching to understand, where we are coming from and how the present world came to be constituted, and obviously trying to name exactly what happened through the march of Western modernity since 1492. So that's one. And then two, as scholars of decoloniality, it seems to me that we are trapped or imprisoned within, this kind of epistemic prison of modernity, because we are using their language, we are using their tools, we are using, their everything. So to what extent can these tools, especially the master's tools, can they help us, bring down, this house? And how exactly should we seek to exit this epistemic prison and change the terms and content of the conversation? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your two questions. To the first question, the answer is yes. I have been doing this in this way with a graduate student for at least 20 years. And they are fascinating seminars because the first two classes I give the overall picture, including with maps. So what I did today in 1 hour, I do it in 3 hours because it's 1.5 each. Longer. It's 4 hours, and then I give the material and they prepare and discuss. And So Javandi, with a graduate student is a fascinating experience. And the graduate students are around 15. The top is 18. Sometimes it is 18, sometimes it's 14. Is tremendously effective. Number one, that they are not just all on the other side of the difference. There are Anglo men and women, but there are people from Korea, people from Africa, people from South America. Some because they have a fellowship, and some because there are a lot of Latinos, Chicanos, Chicanas. So there is a mixture, and there is also a mixture of discipline, because this is a kind of interdisciplinary seminar. So it's fascinating that there is a lot of people from Divinity School. And the people at Divinity School that come to my seminar, they make a connection between decoloniality and theology of liberation. And we have tremendous, fantastic collaboration. There are people in anthropology, there are people in art history, there are people in English. This year I have 3 or 4 students of English. That's a kind of a novelty. There are people from Roman studies, and Roman studies could be people who study in French, people in Italian, people in South America or Spain. So it's tremendously effective, because I ask them to write every week short paragraph, 300 words of not what they learned, but what they felt what they learned. So I work with the emotion. And I ask not papers, I ask reflection, midterm and final report. So they feel free, they feel liberated from the paper, and they just kind of talking about their own problem, and and I ask them, where do you feel coloniality? Because coloniality, you don't understand it rationally. Yeah, you can. But when you really understand coloniality is when you start feeling it. Where coloniality touches you, where affects you. And we are all different, and coloniality affects us different. So they began to reflect about that. But to reflect about coloniality is already a decolonial reflection. Why? Because coloniality is a decolonial concept. So, and I do something very similar, but with undergraduate. But I don't use the sophisticated theory. I work with the cosmologies of Aztecs, Incas, and Mayas. But they work mainly with 90% of videos and bibliography by indigenous people. Because now we have that. We have a lot of indigenous intellectuals that write, and they talk, they have interviews, they give lectures, and the effect again in the kids of 2021 is tremendous. I don't know what they're going to do after that, but I noticed through the process of reflection how they have been affected, how they have been realizing a lot of things about the world, but also about themselves. How coloniality has been blinding them on a lot of issues that we see through the seminar. So the second question, that's a very important. That is related to, indirectly to the other question about the limit of decoloniality to solve this kind of exploitations, oppression, etc. We have to recognize, as you said, that we all in the world who have been educated in Western or Westernized school or university, that number one, one of the 6 imperial languages affect our education. In Argentina, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in China, etc. So we are trapped through the vocabulary, through the discourse, through the narrative, through the images. not just the theological images of that populated the museum of the 16th, 17th century, but all art, what we consider art. I mean, we are kind of trapped in that. So the big task of decoloniality is to delink from that. And to delink from that, you have to relink from something else. And that is the decolonial. It's not a question of decolonizing the university or decolonizing the curriculum, because if you decolonize the university, the curriculum, you still maintain the university, the curriculum, right? You will have a decolonial university or decolonial curriculum, but you have a university and a curriculum. That's the problem. So the question is that there are a lot of things we can do. We cannot decolonize the university for several reasons. We cannot decolonize the curriculum for several reasons, because that's kind of institutional. But there is a lot of work, decolonial work, that we can do at the university, the museum, and other institutions. But there is also a lot of work we can do outside of the university, and I do a lot of other things outside of the university. But recognizing that we are trapped in the vocabulary is essential, and one of the fundamental tasks is any concept, key concept, that we use, we take from modernity, we have to take it apart, to kind of look at when that concept was created, why it was created, and not just the meaning, because the modernity kind of dispute the meaning of a text, of a concept, etc. But when you only discuss the content of the conversation, you remain trapped in the enunciation. So kind of asking that question, when, why, what for this concept or this idea was created, you began to kind of focus on the enunciation. And then you can delink from the enunciation and kind of create the enunciation of decoloniality that we were talking about. Well, I see that there are more questions, but at the same time, we are running out of time. Sabelo appears.
Yeah, maybe we should take this, I mean, as a last question.
Okay.
Then I'll hand over to Sabelo.
Okay.
To close. The question from Mochalifa, where he asks, how do we move from just debating the need, I suppose, for decolonization, for instance, knowledge, to actually doing it? He says, I mean, the history for decolonization has been there, but what has not been there is actually decolonization of knowledge, especially in universities of the South. And also, how do we move from intellectualizing decolonization to socializing it? Yes, that is a summary of it. Then after that, I'll hand it over to you, Sabelo, and perhaps to remind colleagues that our next seminar is on the 22nd of September by Professor Shirin Hassim.
So what we're talking about, the question by Professor Mochalifa?
Yes, the question by Mochalifa, yes.
Okay, let me just review something here. Well, yeah, no, yeah, I agree with you. Just talking about that decolonization has to be done is, yeah, maybe necessary in certain contexts, but among people that are already on the move, we don't need to discuss anymore that decolonization is needed. We are doing it. So that doing have a different kind of aspect. You touch on that and the second part, how do we move from intellectualizing decolonization to socializing it? What? Again, the context. I think that this series of lecture is to kind of talk to each other about decolonization, how we conceive it, how we kind of analyze it, how we analyze coloniality, etc., etc. That is the kind of important intellectualization of decolonization. Why? Because what do you think people are doing in the CIA? The CIA is not just taking the decision that they take. They have constant meetings. What do you think people in the bank are doing when you receive a kind of offer in the credit card? That offer in the credit card is not just a kind of somebody have the kind of the idea. That was a meeting of the think tank of the bank. What will be the next strategy to kind of legally steal the money from people? So what we are doing in this intellectualization is we are think tank. We are think tank that kind of elaborating what the move. Now, what are the move? Of course, I don't know about you. I don't know what Sabelo does, but I do a lot of things. I teach at Duke, but teaching at Duke is, let's say, 50% of my task. I mean, teaching and doing administration, talking to students, advising, etc. Well, I would say 60, so they would kind of, otherwise they will kind of lower my salary. But the other 50 or 40%, I do things. I do things with people in Argentina, with people in South America. We created the Decolonial Summer School 14 years ago in the Netherlands. And that is not just to talk about decolonization, that is kind of planting the seed for people who come there. They are interested not in knowing, I mean, they're interested in finding out how to canalize the energy they have, but they have no option, existing option, that satisfy their needs. So the doing and socializing is building the communal, rebuilding communal. Because the Colonial Summer School, for example, that is a school, we don't teach, they learn. There is conversation. There is kind of learning together. They know a lot of things that we, the faculty, do not know, and we know things that they know. So that they kind of begin to break the image of the professor who knows everything and the student who kind of take notes. So the question is creating the communal, and how you create the communal? In conversation. You create the condition of, so that is, I mean, I created a small kind of book series, a small book series in Buenos Aires for students, for graduate students, because it's an independent publishing house. Because the main publishing house, they translate Zizek and Derrida and all these kind of things, but they don't publish the kind of decolonial text. So yeah, we have to, in the measure of our possibility, we do what we can do in the context that we are operating. Which remain racialized where the colonization rhetoric had. Well, yeah, that is a tremendous task in South Africa and in every part of the world. To bring to in the public sphere, not just discourse anti-racist, racist, but discourse that say how artificial the concept of race and racism is. And the only way to attack that is to produce a different image of the world. And that image of the world cannot come from the UN. It's impossible. That has to come from the people who emotionally feel racialized. Because with people who racialize, they may become aware of the privilege of white supremacy, but they don't feel coloniality. They feel modernity. and they can try to do something to end racism, and that's welcome. But at the same time, there will be always limitation in the way that they can do that, because the limit is the limit of their own racial position, because white are part of the racial spectrum, but whiteness is the only one who classify. So that is a kind of lot of things to be done, my friends.
Okay, thank you so much, Walter. Thank you to everyone, and thank you, Walter, for the generous presentation and also the generous response to the questions. Indeed, the whole idea that thinking is doing is not doing nothing. So we are really trying to respond to some of these challenges which are posed on the chat.
Okay.
And we are continuing this series in the spirit of this conversation and think tanking, as you put it, Walter. Thank you so much for your time, and indeed, this was fantastic.
No, I mean, then again, I mean, I do that not because I need to kind of increase my curriculum. I did it because it's part of the job. It's part of the job that we are doing, a kind of connecting, interconnecting, right? So thank you for creating that this space of conversation.
Thanks, Walter. We'll keep in touch.
We keep in touch.
It was well worth the wait. It was well worth the wait. Thank you.
Okay, bye to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
so
you.
next one, 22nd September. Just
Sure.
thank you very much. Yeah.